Okay.
No, I didn't put it this way.
Okay, fine. So
Does it work?
you're being directional.
Berlin has a special meaning for you all over
Yeah.
your career since very early on.
Sure, yeah.
You have a special connection to it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I first came here in 1977. There was a very interesting music conference at Wannsee, run by a foundation, I can't remember, and it was a conference about minimal music. And there were 20 composers, 18 composers, and only two of the composers, me and Steve Reich, were minimalists. All the rest were the most kind of complex composers in the world, Brian Ferneyhough, whatever, I can't remember who they were. So it was a kind of strange position to have to sort of explain one's work and to defend one's work in a kind of forum where basically everyone was against you, because no one was interested in minimal music, and they all kind of rejected it and resented it. And I wrote a paper called Against Intellectual Complexity in Music, which was subsequently published in October magazine, and nobody kind of understood. And it was just at the time that I'd started composing again, and I had the kind of prototype Michael Nyman band called the Campiello Band, and I played this piece called In Re Don Giovanni, which was a kind of reconstruction of the opening of the catalogue song of in Don Giovanni. It was 2.5 minutes long, and I found that I played it, and obviously I played the whole piece, and I could see that after like 50 seconds, the look on the faces of these the intellectual complexity people or musical complexity, they were already getting bored after 50 seconds. So I thought, okay, it's very strange being a kind of minimalist in this kind of form. So at that time, I also wandered across Checkpoint Charlie into East Berlin, and I mean I still have, and this is like 35 years ago, and I still have very powerful memories of emptiness, of streets without any features and without any human beings. And I remember sort of walking around outside the Berlin Ensemble and just thinking, do people live here as well? There are the buildings, there are the institutions. And then the next time I'm here is like 1986, the first concert with the Michael Nyman Band, actually in this theatre. We're promoted by Matthias Osterwald, who obviously now runs the Berliner Festspiel, for whom I'm doing a concert next month, and who commissioned the kind of opera from me 2 years ago. So there's a lot of continuity. And then I worked here in 97, 98 with Volker Slendorf on Der Unhold. I had a big festival at HDK, as it used to be called, in the early months of 2000. I had a girlfriend who lived here, and I was, this point of kind of buying an apartment together. So it's all, and and I've discovered that my natural tendency is to want to hang out in the Old East. I mean, that when I remember when I first, I'm probably on that 1977 trip, and I went to West Berlin, and I just found it was too kind of self-congratulatory American. It just seemed like, we have to establish our kind of Western capitalist credentials to fight, to fight the sort of power of what's going on across the wall. And I felt sort of uncomfortable with it because it was it was sort of familiar. It was a sort of familiar bourgeois culture that I knew. And I guess I must have sort of checked out the wall. I don't think I took any photographs. And then obviously since the wall came, I mean the one thing that I really regret is that, you know, when the wall came down in 1989, a friend of mine, a Slovenian friend of mine who lives in Paris, was actually here, and he kind of phoned me up and said, "Michael, you must get on a plane and come over. Things are happening." And I was busy doing a concert, or I was somewhere else, and you know, I would love to have kind of been here in a way, and this is kind of interesting, in the way that I wasn't curious to be in Cairo, for instance, last week. So it's because, you know, I'm a Western boy, and, you know, I know about communism and I know about capitalism. It felt very kind of close to me because I lived through the Cold War, obviously. And I don't have the same feelings about Middle Eastern politics. It's kind of interesting that it would have been very easy for me to get on a plane to Cairo, but didn't. So it's a kind of interesting parallel. And then, you know, obviously I've hung around a lot in Mitte, and I've made a lot of, shot a lot of film in Berlin, and obviously working with Babelsberg with Schlendorf is, you know, a very interesting process. So, and here I am again, you know.
I would like to go a little bit further back in time, at the times of Portsmouth Symphony. At this time, it seemed to me that to you music was fun. Now it's getting serious. You started off after Portsmouth Symphony. You stripped down Purcell. You stripped down Mozart. Will there be a time when you strip down Nyman?
Well, maybe that's what I'm doing all the time. I mean, the whole process of what one uses as musical material is actually a very, very instructive one, and I have this project, which is a sort of art book. You know, I have a series of kind of A3 sheets of manuscript paper, and you know, they're filled with kind of musical ideas, yeah, and what I aim to do is to print all these sheets in a book with a transparent. Each page will have a transparent cover. That's transparent covering, and on the transparent covering, I will write a kind of family tree. So if we say on these A3 pages there are 6 or 8 or 10 musical ideas, and this is a sheet that I wrote in 1983, I will, you know, on the top I would say, okay, this musical idea I used in The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat in 1987. The second musical idea I've not used for anything. The third musical idea went into the second string quartet, and I subsequently reused it in something else. So you're getting this kind of creative flow chart, which is fascinating to me, and which I'm the only person who can decipher these. Because even if there's someone who knows my music really intimately, they will look at this thing and say, where does that come from? Where does it go? Has it been used? But I can do that. And I'm now in the process of getting all my kind of manuscript scores digitized, because they're sitting in a cupboard. I could have a house fire, and there's like 25, 30 years of work that would just disappear. So actually, when I get back to London on Friday, I've got a young woman coming around to start kind of photographing, and I've actually started already doing it. So yeah, I mean, we could sit down and I would say, okay, you hear this piece of music and you think that the material I've used is totally related only to this particular piece, and I'd say, but there's this kind of little fragment which I'd sort of, you know, this little sort of patch of skin which has a sort of particular DNA which you think only provides the kind of content, the organic content of such and such a piece that you know. And I allowed my imagination to be challenged and developed by this little fragment, and it became this. And in the process of developing it into the secondary project, other kind of ideas are thrown up as well that then again may go back over there. So it's a constant case of invention and reinvention and kind of free flow of ideas. And it always struck me, I remember reading, when I was a music critic, I remember reading something that Stockhausen wrote, and I felt was strange at the time, even when I wasn't a composer. He said, he writes a piece of music, and every part of that formation process of that piece, when he's finished the piece, he destroys. Now, I'm kind of the opposite, because the formation process is never finished.
But you can hear that when listening to your
Well, sometimes you can, and sometimes I cover my traces, because the one thing you can't hear, because the one thing that's kind of fundamental to my work, I think, is harmony. And I can sort of use the same harmony in 2 or 3 different pieces, and it's a sort of private game with myself. Generally, it's not obvious. But also this piece in Re Don Giovanni, which takes the first 16 bars of Madamina, is a chord progression that I think is the best chord progression that Mozart ever wrote, and I kind of have been through the whole 620 pieces of music by Mozart, and he only ever used it once, and I have probably created 1.5 hours of music out of this particular chord sequence, and I'm still doing it. And sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not obvious, and there will be one day when I'll make an album and call it 16 measures of Mozart as you've never heard them before, whatever.
I just saw that documentary by Sylvia Bach recently at television, and at the end of it, you were entering the big concert hall.
Sure, yeah.
And I wonder if there still is something like an adrenaline rush. Is there a nervousness in you after all these concerts?
Well, it's kind of interesting. Well, there's 2 things about that documentary. In order to give it a sort of narrative, it appeared that it was my sort of most important aim in life was to play at the Albert Hall. It's very important, but it's just another concert. And on the other hand, because British culture looks at me in a certain way, I feel very neglected by formal, conventional British musical culture. So in a sense, it made me feel very radical when I didn't have a concert at the Albert Hall, because everybody plays there. And I've been sort of going there as from like the age of 10 or whatever. So I was very kind of pleased that I hadn't played at the Albert Hall. But then when they invited me to do the concert, I was equally pleased, if not more pleased, that my music had been kind of recognized. But it's a sort of double take. You want to be wanted, but you're also very happy to be rejected. And as a concert, I would say that's the most uncomfortable concert I've ever played in my life. And I've played in large concert halls, but nothing quite as big as that. And putting the Michael Nyman band on a stage that size is kind of really odd, because when you're on a big stage in a conventional theatre, you can use curtains to create a much more kind of intimate space. So that was kind of weird. I couldn't see how many people were in the audience, whether it was kind of 500 or 5,000. We did a program that included the new piece, the musicologist scores, plus familiar stuff from Greenaway and the piano and whatever, plus 2 or 3 things where I thought, this is my only chance with that kind of public, with the BBC. I better put in some of the Celan songs, etc. So it was a kind of concert that because it was also a very limited duration. I think I was given 50 minutes or something, and it had to be. So it didn't have the kind of flow, and I didn't feel I had the control over the kind of theatricality of presenting a program that I do when I play here, for instance. So actually, it was very difficult, and I felt very, to tell the truth, very isolated. You know, I didn't feel that I was embraced, and I didn't embrace it. They didn't embrace me, but people say it was a very good concert. But I was relieved to have got shot of it, and I've never played the Albert Hall again, except if I do it in my terms, so I can create the stage picture. You know, I'm not stuck with. And the other thing about the BBC and the proms is that there's a huge kind of organization. So there's this producer, and there's this stage manager, and there's this, and there's this, and this. And usually when I do a concert here, say, you know, there'll be a promoter and a stage manager, and that's it. So you have a much more kind of intimate relationship with who you're playing to and how you present yourself. Whereas the Albert Hall, it's the British establishment, and it's a nightmare.
What would you say is the aim of film music? To help the film, to stand alone, to be an opposite, to cast a shadow, or?
Well, the interesting, the opposite thing is kind of interesting, and I think in the early days of working with Peter Greenaway, you know, he'd obviously, you know, we both read kind of Hans Eisler on film or the Adorno book or whatever. So we were kind of both aware that there doesn't need to be an identity and identification of what you hear and what you see. So I think maybe in those early Greenaway films there was a kind of sense of playing with opposites or playing with parallels, because it is only parallel structures. But generally the music is kind of mimicry or support rather than establishing a kind of narrative of its own. But since my music kind of proceeds in a kind of structural manner that is not like anyone else's music, and really is not like the way of presenting film narrative, not the way of presenting dialogue, there was always, for me, a sense of how is it these two things work. You know, they're both time arts. They're both sort of in the same kind of physical, emotional, sonic space. But, you know, my music does it like that, and even a kind of Greenaway narrative or dialogue does it like that. So there's always a slight kind of discontinuity in the connecting of the two, you know, which is maybe why I don't write as much film music now as I should do. But the other thing that's important to me is that on principle and just by practice, I'll never be one of those composers who kind of is happy to hide himself away. You know, this whole thing about underscoring, this whole thing about the most successful scores are those that you don't notice. I mean, that to me is bollocks. You know, why would I waste my time writing music that I don't want people to notice, and that merely in a kind of hidden way affects the way you guys respond to what you see and hear. So I'm never happier than you know, I'm very proud of most of the films that I've added music to, and you know, I'm even prouder when somebody would say to me, yeah, I think the score, the music is great, I like the film so much, or when they say, yeah, I love the music from the piano, and my question is, you know, how do you think it works in the film? And they say, well, I haven't bothered to see the film. So I can get away. I think I have the best of both worlds. You know, the music is independent enough to separate itself from the film, but codependent enough with the film to work with the film. Because, you know, directors are very ruthless. If the music doesn't work, either they ask you to replace it, or in the process of syncing the music to the picture, they just reject it. I mean, so there's a lot of music that was rejected that I wrote for the piano that Jane rejected. There's music that Greenaway commissioned that was not used or was used in a different place. Music for Wonderland. I mean, it's interesting if if anyone was sort of crazy enough to take a soundtrack album and listen to what's on the soundtrack album and then try and locate all that music in the film, you will find some gaps, because what happens is that you record the music, and at the same time as you give the soundtrack to the director, you're preparing for the release of the soundtrack album. So the soundtrack album represents the music as composed and recorded, and not necessarily the music as used. So, for instance, if you listen to the soundtrack from the piano, there's a big sequence of about 12 minutes, I think, called something like A Wild Distant Shore, and you try to find it in the film, it isn't there, because I wrote it for Jane under her express wishes, and when she heard it, when she put it with the images of the opening scene on the beach, she decided that she just wanted dialogue and sound effects, didn't need any music. So that's kind of interesting, and you spend all that time, and there's no way I would have said to Jane, I'm not going to bother to write this because I don't think you'll use it. I can't, despite the fact that I'm sort of quite sophisticated and also kind of cheeky, I would never actually make that sort of proposition to a director.
The film music community has just lost John Barry.
Yeah.
Did you know him?
Unfortunately, I didn't know him. Obviously, his work. I mean, it's interesting that the amount of music that they played since he died, it just made me realize. I mean, I think there are two, broadly speaking, two kinds of composers. There are those soundtrack composers who part of the essence of whose work is like the sound of what they do. So I would put John Barry and Morricone in that camp, and then the rest of us where's the musical material? And I know that some of the sounds that John Barry used for the Bond films, kind of makes me feel like as an orchestrator, very dull, and not really using the resources of the orchestra in a way that is particularly imaginative. And Morricone went one stage further, because he went beyond the orchestra and would use the Jew's harp and would use those kind of 1960s Italian sort of pop guitar sounds and things like that.
Is that why you stripped down Morricone into clay?
Did I do that? The shootout, it's kind of interesting, the shootouts, that I felt that I'd written something based on, There's a piece in Prospero's books called Miranda, and I took the kind of chord, the harmonic structure of Miranda, and made this piece, which is the shootout. And I thought, okay, this is kind of Morricone, and I played it to Michael Winterbottom, and I said, and this is a piece that I wrote, it was my decision to write it, and I said to Michael, I really think this will be a beautiful piece of music to use with this sequence. And he said, why? And I said, well, in the first place, it sounds like Morricone, and the images of these guys in long kind of leather coats and whatever, so it would be perfect. And he said, yeah, fine. And so he tried it out, and I thought it worked extremely well. Then when I saw the film, he'd removed it. But the music, actually, that's the point. I could use it for something else. Yeah.
There's a lot of music you could use.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of music I do use.
Be a lot of music in here as well.
Well, yeah, but most of it's just about to be digitized, as I say.
Unfortunately, I got to go.
Okay.
There's another screening of the first direction.
Thanks a lot.
Ralph Fiennes.
What time is that?